I've never believed in ghosts or any of that supernatural stuff. You hear stories, sure, but I always figured they were just tales to scare kids or get a reaction. That was until it happened to me. My name's Juan, and this all started a few months ago. I'd been working late and got home much later than usual. The streets were quiet, and I decided to take a shortcut past the old cemetery. I'd driven by it hundreds of times and never thought much of it. It's just a place, right? That night, though, I parked my car along the side of the road near the cemetery to make a quick call. The streetlights flickered, but I didn't think much of it. As I was about to drive off, I heard something strange. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a bouncing ball. I looked around, confused, because it was nearly midnight and no one should have been around. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing inside the cemetery, just behind the wrought iron gate. He was holding a ball, looking at me. My first thought was, what the hell is a kid doing in there this late? I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, he was gone. I shook it off, thinking maybe I was tired or seeing things. But the next night, it happened again. I was driving the same route home, and as I passed by the cemetery, I heard it, the ball bouncing. This time, I slowed down and glanced over. There he was again, the same boy standing inside the gate, bouncing his ball, just watching me. I stopped the car and rolled down the window, trying to make sense of it. He didn't say anything. But then, out of nowhere, he whispered, "Can you help me?" My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't about to get out of my car at midnight. So I just shook my head and drove off. The whole way home, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His pale face, his eyes that seemed hollow. Over the next few nights, things got worse. I kept seeing him. Every time I drove by the cemetery, he'd be there, staring at me, bouncing that ball, asking for help. I ignored him. I wasn't going to get involved in whatever was going on there. It didn't feel right. Then, one night, as I was driving home, something happened that I can't explain. I glanced in my rearview mirror and there he was, sitting in the back seat of my car, staring right at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned around, but the back seat was empty. I sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but it wasn't. The boy started appearing everywhere, not just near the cemetery, but in my home. I'd see him in reflections, standing in doorways, peeking around the corners. My wife, Camila, started noticing things too, like lights flickered and strange noises echoed through the house at night. It was like the boy was everywhere, and he wasn't going to leave me alone until I did something. Camila and I were terrified. We didn't know what to do. So we went to an elderly woman in town who was known for helping people with these kind of things. She listened to our story and nodded slowly. "The boy is trapped," she said. "He wants something from you, but you've been ignoring him. You need to acknowledge him, or he will never leave you in peace." She gave us instructions on how to perform a cleansing ritual for the house and told me that if the boy appeared again, I needed to speak to him directly. That night, I was prepared. Sure enough, as I was lying in bed, I heard the sound of a ball bouncing down the hallway. I sat up, heart racing, and there he was, standing at the foot of my bed. The boy, his eyes met mine, and for the first time, I didn't look away. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. And then, just like that, he was gone. After that, the encounter stopped. The house was quiet again, and I didn't see the boy anymore, but I can't forget him. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of a ball bouncing in the distance. And I wonder if he's really gone, or if he's just waiting. I studied dramatic arts, and when we were in the second year of the program, we had to perform the play Joan of Arc, written by Friedrich Schiller. I was playing Joan of Arc, and my overall performance was good, but there was one scene I struggled to interpret. In the play, my character acts in the name of God, believing she's carrying out his will. There's an antagonist who symbolizes a demon. I believe he was called the Black Knight, or the Shadow, or something like that. In the scene, Joan of Arc sees this representation of evil for the first time, and no matter how hard I tried to act scared, the teacher would always stop me at that part. She would say that it didn't seem real, that I wasn't convincing in portraying someone seeing a specter. She asked if I had ever been frightened by something supernatural, and I had to admit that I hadn't. I had never seen anything beyond this world, and I didn't believe in ghosts or demons. Witches were just a myth to me. I have to admit, during that time, I had doubts about the existence of God. Although I was raised in a Christian environment, I've always been a very rational person. And at that moment, I believed that you had to see something to believe in it. Time was passing and I wasn't improving in my performance. I was on the verge of failing that class, which at my school meant losing the entire year. So I came up with the idea of seeking out a paranormal experience. At first, I thought about hiring a medium, but I wasn't very sure. Then, I thought about going to a cemetery at night. I believed that even if I didn't see something strange, at least I'd feel fear being in the middle of the night surrounded by graves. I didn't plan to go alone. I wasn't that desperate to put myself at risk. Even if I didn't encounter a spirit, I could still run into someone who meant me harm. So, I decided to ask my closest friends to come with me. Luckily, they thought it was an excellent idea. There were 2 guys and 2 girls. We decided to go on a Saturday night since we didn't have class the next day. We entered the cemetery before it got dark and waited for nightfall. The place was huge. We first walked among the gravestones of those who had been buried there. Some were neglected, clearly not visited for a long time. Others had several floral arrangements, photos, or letters. I can't deny there was a somewhat heavy energy in the air. Then, one of my friends had the idea of starting to tell scary stories. He had this theory that spirits and ghosts are mostly energy, and if you start thinking about them and feeling like they might appear, you feed that spectral energy. So he began telling us about terrifying deaths that he had read about on the website. They were actually quite disturbing. We were in the middle of this when suddenly my friend said she saw something strange. In the distance, it looked like someone had lit a fire in an area far from the graves. We moved closer, trying not to make any noise, and obviously didn't shine our flashlights in that direction because we didn't want whoever was there at that hour to notice us. I started to see people there. They were dressed entirely in black, but we couldn't see their faces. They had formed a circle around a small fire near 2 mausoleums that were noticeably older and larger than the others around them. They were speaking in a language I couldn't recognize. It seemed like they were performing a ritual. We moved closer to see better, but not enough for them to notice us, and we hid behind some smaller mausoleums. Then, we saw one of the figures approach the center of the circle with a book in hand. The person placed the book on the ground near the fire while lifting an animal. It was a cat. It seemed to be asleep because it barely moved. Then, the person holding the cat pulled out a dagger from their clothing and stabbed the poor animal. The cat let out a scream of pain that still echoes in my mind to this day. I could swear that at that moment, the flames grew larger. I saw a gush of blood and I couldn't contain myself. I screamed. I'm not sure if I was the only one because I was too shocked to notice if my friends were as terrified as I was. The people dressed in black turned to look at us. They scattered in all directions, and it seemed like some of them weren't walking, they were floating. We started running, trying to find the exit. We could feel them chasing us, whispering and laughing with sharp and guttural voices. I'm not sure they were all women because some sounded masculine. At one point, I felt my chest burning. I couldn't keep running. I looked to see if they were still behind me. but I couldn't see anything, yet I could still hear the whispers. I started to fall behind until my friends grabbed my hand. We still couldn't see the exit anywhere, but we were passing by a small chapel. One of my friends signaled for us to go inside. We tried to open the door, but it was locked. The voices were getting closer. So, one of my friends somehow forced the door open, and we managed to get inside. As soon as we closed the door, the voices disappeared. We stayed in silence for a few moments, catching our breath. None of us could believe what had just happened. We began to argue about what we should do. My friend wanted us to stay in the chapel until morning, but the rest of us didn't think that was a very sensible idea. I suggested the most rational thing would be to call the police. I dialed the emergency number on my phone and made the report. But the person who answered didn't sound very convinced by our story. Still, we decided to wait and hope someone would come to help us. We stayed there for an hour, but eventually we accepted that no one was coming. Only one of us was from the city where we studied, but his parents didn't live nearby, and it didn't make much sense to call them. Another hour passed before one of my friends decided to peek out the door to see if they were still there. Apparently, no one was around anymore. We thought about it for a second and then left. This time, we didn't run to avoid drawing attention. We walked quickly, and the path seemed longer than when we had entered. We managed to get out without further problems, and by then, we were all convinced we had witnessed a witchcraft or a satanic ritual. That night, I stayed at my friend's house. After saying goodbye to our other two friends, we went straight to her place. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the cat scream in my mind. Then, at one point during the night, I saw my friend moving. She seemed to be dreaming, moving her arms like she was trying to free herself from something. I tried to wake her gently by speaking to her, but it didn't work. So, I placed my hand on her arm, and it felt like I had touched a hot stove. At that moment, she finally opened her eyes. I looked at my hand and realized I had been burned. And when we looked at her arm, it had burn marks too. For the next few nights, I didn't sleep much either. I could only fall asleep for a couple of hours, but I kept dreaming about the ritual and the witches in the cemetery. All of us who had gone that day were affected in the same way, but one of my friends was the worst off. Almost 2 weeks after the incident, we gathered and realized we all had nightmares and some marks on our skin. But one of my friends began telling us that it wasn't just happening while he slept. Sometimes, when he was alone in his room, he would hear a woman's voice whispering in his ear. After that, he would lose consciousness for several minutes, and when he came to, he had done things he couldn't remember. Once, he threw some of his clothes out the window. Another time, he went to the kitchen and smashed several plates on the floor. After these episodes, he always noticed bruises on his body. Since he lived in a student residence, the other tenants had complained about him, and the landlord had given him notice that he had to move out the following month. So, I helped him find a room where I lived, and then we decided that we should seek some kind of help. My friend's mother was very religious. Although she didn't live in the city, she knew a priest who had performed a few exorcisms. So, we contacted him and told him what was happening, hoping he could help us. The priest gave us an appointment. It was quite far from where we studied, but we went to the parish where he worked. We told him everything we had seen and what had been happening to us. The priest told us that, based on what we described, we had witnessed a ritual of power reaffirmation. It's believed that witches and warlocks perform these rituals because they've made a pact with the devil. He grants them power, and in return, they must make blood sacrifices from time to time, sometimes with animals, and although less common nowadays, sometimes with humans. He said what was happening to us was sort of a curse for disturbing the ceremony. However, curses don't affect everyone the same way. Some souls are more open to both the spiritual realm and to negative energies. He offered to help us and asked us to come once a week to perform prayers and sprinkle holy water around the places where we lived. For my friend, who was suffering the most, he said he needed to do a more private session. It wasn't exactly an exorcism, but it involved more prayers with the priest. We all agreed and followed his instructions exactly as he gave them. After a few months, everything became just a story to tell. Even my friend returned to normal, although it took him a bit longer than the rest of us. My mother always used to say, just as there is good, there is evil. I took that phrase differently. I was objective, since I didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or even God. Until that night when life slapped me in the face and showed me that evil definitely exists. My friends Emilio and Pepe had planned a party for the weekend to celebrate Roberto's birthday. We had been friends since elementary school, and now that we were in high school, everything was amazing. I offered to host the party at my house since my parents and my brother were going to visit my grandparents and wouldn't be home that night. Everything was perfect. They agreed, and we invited 5 more classmates from our school to liven up the atmosphere. It's worth mentioning that it wasn't unusual to hear footsteps at night or for doors to slam in my house. Once, my mom even told us she saw something that looked like a child running in the yard. Despite that, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. There was always a logical explanation for things, so I didn't give it much thought. Although, I do remember one time when I couldn't find my charger and went into my older brother's room to look for it. While searching, I found a Ouija board under his bed. I laughed to myself and kept looking, not knowing that discovering that board would lead to the worst night of my life. The weekend finally arrived, and I was excited. A party with my friends meant music, dancing, alcohol, long talks, and a lot of fun. My parents were loading the necessary things into the car, and they asked if I was sure I didn't want to go with them. I assured them I was fine, nodding my head. I reminded them that it was one of my best friend's birthdays and I couldn't miss the party. They didn't insist, gave me some money, kissed me on the forehead, and I said goodbye to them. When I heard the car drive away, I threw myself onto the couch, sighing with relief, never suspecting that this would turn into a horror story. A few minutes later, my peace was interrupted when I heard someone breathing heavily in my brother's room. It was loud and definitely not normal. I jumped, but tried not to think too much of it. I had probably misheard. Besides, it was daytime. And according to what people say, strange things don't happen with the sun out. So I decided to forget about it and called Pepe to ask when they'd be arriving and to let him know my parents had already left. I was about to grab the phone when I suddenly heard something that sent a chill down my spine. Someone was calling my name. I heard it clearly, Javier, Javier. But it was a voice I'd never heard before. As I listened closer, it seemed to come from my brother's room. No one was home, but every time I told myself the voice wasn't real, it seemed to grow louder and closer. Goosebumps covered my skin, and just when I realized that whatever was making that sound was right behind me, the doorbell rang. That seemed to make the voice disappear. I breathed deeply and tried to calm down, convincing myself that since I was alone, my mind must have played a trick on me. But no, my horror story was real. I opened the door to find my friends, who brought everything we needed to grill the meat and 2 boxes of beer. I was thrilled to see them and invited them in. I hugged Roberto and wished him a happy birthday, asking him to wait for a minute. I ran to my room and gave him his gift in a small bag. I had saved up for it, and I knew that seeing his favorite team's jersey would make him very happy. And I was right. The mood was light, and we started chatting. After a while, we decided to start grilling the meat in the backyard, so we brought out the speaker. After a couple of hours, everything was ready, and we called out the rest of the group to begin the party. With all the excitement, I completely forgot about what had happened earlier when I was alone in the house. I just wanted to enjoy the moment with my friends. Everyone arrived, and the music kept playing non-stop. We ate, sang our favorite songs at the top of our lungs, and then danced to electronic music while drinking beer from our red cups. I couldn't remember the last time I had so much fun. I was so happy. By midnight, when we were all pretty tired, We decided to turn down the music and head inside because it was getting cold outside. We sat down and started talking and laughing, reminiscing about old times. After that, we played Truth or Dare. And finally, Roberto suggested we tell our scariest horror story with the lights off. So that's what we did. Even though I was a skeptic, it was fun to see how scared everyone else got while hearing horror stories and how much they believed in those things. I remembered what I had seen earlier in my brother's room and told them about it. They got excited and urged me to get the Ouija board so we could play with it. I didn't really care one way or another, but one of them said it wasn't a good idea because his mom had told him Ouija boards were the devil's work. Everyone laughed at him and reassured him it was just a game. I walked over to my brother's room, and as I reached for the door, I remembered what I had heard earlier in the day. I won't lie, it scared me a little. What can I say? I'm human. But I gathered my courage and opened the door. I could hear my friend's laughter coming from the living room, and I smiled. But that smile quickly disappeared when I opened the door. Because if my eyes weren't deceiving me, there was a figure under the bed sheets, and I could clearly see it breathing. This can't be real, I told myself. I could have screamed, but nothing came out of my mouth. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them slowly, the figure was gone. It had to be another cruel joke played by my mind. I grabbed the board from the floor and took it to the living room. I didn't tell my friends what I had just seen. We opened the board, placed it on the table, read the instructions, and sat around it. We all put our fingers on the small wooden planchette and began asking questions. Emilio asked if there was anyone else in the house, but nothing happened. So another one of the guys asked the same question, but louder this time. And that's when we all felt the planchette move toward the yes option. What nonsense, I thought. Someone was definitely moving it on purpose. But then Roberto's voice interrupted my thoughts as he asked, "Who are you?" This time, the planchette didn't move, and we all looked at each other, shrugging. I decided to ask something and see what happened. I remembered the recent events and said, "Was that you I saw in my brother's bed?" There was nothing but silence. But just as someone was about to ask another question, the lights suddenly went out, and we heard my brother's door creak open. Whatever had been in there was now running towards us. My friend screamed in terror, and I just stood there in shock, closing my eyes and begging for it all to end. Fear coursed through my body, whether I wanted to believe it or not. Just as we felt it closing in on us, the lights came back on, and we looked at each other, some of us with our mouths open in disbelief. One of my friends grabbed his backpack from the couch and left without saying a word. Our horror story had just begun. The rest of us laughed nervously and made jokes about it, with some accusing me of turning off the lights as a prank since it was my house. I just laughed and didn't deny it because deep down, I knew it had all been real, and I didn't want to scare them even more. I suggested we go to the cemetery for a new, terrifying experience because, honestly, I didn't want to stay in my house anymore. I didn't want to be alone later that night or continue playing with the Ouija board, so I tried to act brave by making that suggestion. Roberto, excited as always, said yes and offered to drive us in his car since he loved these kind of things. The others weren't very convinced after what had just happened, but when I told them it was all just a prank, they reconsidered and agreed to go. On the way, one of them remembered hearing that when you play with a Ouija board, you have to close these sessions properly by following a series of steps, or else you leave a portal open and bad things can happen. We fell silent until Emilio said it didn't matter. We could finish the game when we got back, and everything would be fine. Feeling a little more at ease, but still quiet, we continued to drive, which took about 10 minutes. The city cemetery was huge since it was the only one around. It was fenced off, and many people we had once known were buried there. When we arrived, we saw there was a guard. We thought it would be difficult to get in, and deep down, we all hoped he wouldn't let us. But he was very friendly. We told him we were there for a school project and he said it was no problem, as long as we brought him some dinner and a soda the next day. We entered, planning to make a quick tour while sharing more scary experiences, then head home to rest since it had been a long day. The vibe of the place was strange. The deeper we went, the darker everything seemed. The light from our phones didn't reach very far, so the trees sometimes looked like deformed giants or humanoid figures. Our nervous giggles echoed through the cemetery, and when we reached what seemed to be the center of the place, everything felt off. We continued slowly along the narrow paths, occasionally stepping on a grave by accident. We were quite startled when a black cat suddenly crossed our path, weaving between our feet and purring. Maybe it's the night guard's pet, we thought, but our hearts nearly jumped out of our chest when we realized the cat stood up on two legs, started walking like a human, and cursed at us. We couldn't believe it. It felt like a nightmare, like something impossible. One of my friends clutched his chest and fainted. We tried to wake him up, but nothing worked. We needed to get out of there, but we couldn't leave him behind. The cat walked away on two legs, still shouting at us until we lost sight of it. After a few minutes, my friend regained consciousness. When he opened his eyes and realized where we were, he started crying. We tried to calm him down, explaining that we needed to leave, and he understood. As we helped him up, we heard something I will never forget. It was the sound of a woman laughing, not just one, but a whole crowd. We looked in every direction, but couldn't see anything. When we shone our lights toward the trees, they were there. Women with long hair, completely naked, floating and grimacing as if trying to smile. Their mouths revealed huge fangs instead of teeth. We screamed at the top of our lungs and started running. Each time we shone the light ahead, we saw more and more of them. We tripped over graves multiple times, but we didn't care. We just wanted to reach the exit. After frantic screams and desperate cries, we finally made it to the entrance where the guard found us. He asked if we were okay after seeing our pale faces and noticing our heavy breathing. We didn't want to say anything. We thanked him and just left. Roberto drove us back quickly, and no one spoke a word during the ride. Finally, I broke the silence by asking Emilio if I could stay at his house because honestly, I didn't want to go back to mine and be alone after everything that had happened. He said yes, that I could sleep in the guest room and head home the next day. I didn't sleep at all during the few hours left of the night because I kept hearing the same breathing and the same voice calling my name over and over. I cried from fear for a long time before finally falling asleep. How could I still be a skeptic after everything my senses had just shown me? I concluded that all the strange noises and unexplained phenomena in my house were probably due to my brother's Ouija board, and I deeply regretted playing with it and telling my friends about it. When my parents returned, I told them that strange things had been happening, although I left out the part about the Ouija board to avoid getting my brother in trouble and to keep him from knowing I had taken it without permission. So they decided to bless the house, and it worked, though only for a few months. After that, the noises became more frequent, and I started having nightmares every night. Everything stopped after I got married and moved out of my parents' house. 10 years of peace, but I'm sharing this story now because lately, I've been dreaming about those women again. And the worst part? Yesterday, I saw one of them in my yard, smiling from ear to ear. I hope this doesn't turn into a new horror story.